and welcome to another episode of God is Not a Theory with Ken Fish. I'm your host, Grant Pemberton, and on today's episode, we have the amazing, incredible, fourth time returning guest. He's our man with a plan on the ground. The indelible Avner Boskey is joining us. And Ken, you are here with us from somewhere at a secret location. You are tucked away. We know that you're in the middle of a few events, and so you've literally pulled over to the side of the car because this is that important, so that we can bring you the updates of what's going on around the world, right?
Yeah, kind
So-
of. I know I'm supposed to have a better backdrop and a better studio. All the things I've had people kind of email me, text me, call me, lecture me in person about my need for better backdrops. But unfortunately, today, this was as good as it was going to get. And none of our listeners would know it, but it was a little bit of a challenge just for me to get on the air. But finally, I am, and here we are.
Excellent. Well, thanks for taking time out and joining us. And Avner, I know it's late where you are, so Ken, why don't you just give it a go?
Yeah. So, Avner, welcome back to our podcast, God is Not a Theory. It's always a real pleasure to have you on the show.
The joy to be with you, Ken.
All right. Well, since you've been on the show in the past, people have a sense of you, at least if they're return listeners. And, one of the things I really appreciate about you is that you've always been able to give us an on-the-ground perspective of what's happening in Israel. You moved there as your permanent home. I don't even know now. What's it been, 25 or 30 years ago?
Since 78.
78. Okay. Well, so even further than that. And we've had you on since the war in Gaza began, but we may have some listeners who either have never heard you before or who have forgotten some of what we discussed. So let's just say this as we're recording here. The Gaza war has been underway for nearly 7 months. I think I saw something this morning, if I have my day count correct. I think it said it's been 208 days. And so from an Israeli perspective, someone who lives in Israel, carries an Israeli passport, is living with the reality of having Hamas not too terribly far from where you live in the south of the country, and having just endured this massive attack from Iran. How is the war going, and what's the anticipated end game? What are people thinking about this anyway?
These are very long questions you just asked.
Good.
I'll try to give you a McDonald's answer here in terms of fast food. We're 62 seconds from Hamas rockets when they're firing in our direction. They haven't been firing in our direction since about a month or two. What's been going on? There's a long background and a short background. The long background is that God does not seem to manage his prophetic plan on the earth that well, because he brings the Jewish people back to a land which he says is their promised land. And in the meantime, you have jihad in 638, where people come in and take the land over, settle on it, and declare that it will never come back to the Jewish people. And so basically, when the Jewish people come back, it's a reverse of jihad. And the Islamic world doesn't like that, because even the term Islam in Arabic means submission. It's not peace. It's a different root for peace, salam. But this is Islam, and it's submission. And the whole point is the world needs to be submitted to the last prophet, which would be, in their view, Muhammad. So when you get Jews coming in who are not Muslims, who are loving the land, it's blossoming, they're taking it over, they're growing things, they thrive, and to Islam, that's an offense, especially when you have attempts through the Muslim Brotherhood. I don't, most of your friends, listeners may not know what that is, but starting in the 20s in Islam, there was a revival movement. And this revival movement was back to the Quran as opposed to back to the Bible. And they said basically what Muhammad said, they would wear bracelets saying, what would Muhammad do? And so their concept was, let us restore and make Islam great again, the way it was going back in the 600s. And that would include, among the 5 pillars of Islam, jihad is the 6th pillar. And it would include, jihad means basically striving or struggling in the name of Allah. And it means taking over the world, like Sherwin-Williams, cover the earth, but instead of red paint, it's green Islam. And so the point here is to retake any areas which have been lost to Islam. That's considered a travesty. And so Israel was lost to Islam and needs to be retaken. And so from the 20s, going back to Hajj al-Amin al-Husseini, there's been a desire to slaughter the Jews and reestablish a caliphate here. I just noticed that yesterday in Hamburg, people were carrying signs in German, not in Arabic, saying, restore the caliphate to Germany. Well, the caliphate never came to Germany, but this would be new territory to take.
Right.
So this is what we've been dealing with here. That's why it's been going on for so long, and there's not going to be an end to it until you have the clash of truths here. And this is why, as I said, tongue in cheek, God is bringing the Jewish people back here, and the rest of the Middle East isn't that happy about that. They may phrase it in different ways, but that's at the root of it. It's, if the Jews can come back, then Islam is not triumphant.
So when you started your answer, you made a comment about 638, and again, I want to just make sure everybody understands what we're talking about here. We are not talking about the dinner hour and dinner being served slightly late, 8 minutes late specifically, and instead of calling everyone to eat at 6:30, they got called at 6:38. This is in the year 638, or as it is commonly reckoned, 605 years after the resurrection of Jesus. So the Muslim armies had been busy expanding since the time of Muhammad, and they came to the Holy Land and they took Jerusalem. And a lot of things ensued from that, including, by the way, the building of the Al-Aqsa Mosque and some other important shrines that are in that area, shrines and mosques. But the Al-Aqsa Mosque, as it is commonly reckoned, is believed to be the 3rd most holy mosque in all of Islamic lands. And so they have a particular attachment to it, similar to what the Jews have as their attachment to the Temple Mount. And it happens to be that the Al-Aqsa Mosque sits right on top of the Temple Mount. So there's an almost, there's an intrinsic conflict between Islam and Judaism because of that one location. And the mosque is built on top of the ruins of the Second Temple, on top of the Temple Mount. And the Muslims believe that once land has been Muslim land, it remains Muslim land forever. And of course, the Jews believe that God gave the land to them by.
It's kind of like the Eagles in Hotel California. You can check out anytime you want, but you can never leave.
Yeah, that's right. That's exactly right. So we have the conflict between Judaism and Islam, and we could say it this way, it really centers right on the Temple Mount. Now, there are other conflicts, and of course, Islam has important sites in Saudi Arabia as well. But right now, we're talking about Jerusalem. And so in the Islamic mind, if it's ever been Muslim, it's always Muslim. And if it's ever owned or controlled by anybody other than Muslims, then it becomes part of the locus of jihad. And so the Muslims took it and they controlled it for a very long time until really the fall of the Ottoman Empire. The Crusaders took it, but that resulted in continual war. And eventually the Muslims took it back. And so with the ending of the Ottoman Empire at the end of the First World War, which was 1918, now this came into the control of the British, but there was no power, there was no strength within the Islamic empires to address this at that time. And so from 1918 all the way down to the present, they've been wanting to take it back. And in between, Israel came into being as a nation state. And the Muslims believe Israel shouldn't be there and they will never properly own it. And so there will be war from generation to generation, either until the Muslims are defeated, the Jews are defeated, or Jesus returns.
It'll be interesting when he returns what language he'll be speaking, whether it'll be Arabic or Hebrew.
It will be very interesting. I agree with you. All right. Yeah. So that's all backstory for anybody who didn't quite follow everything Avner was saying. But from the coming in 638 until now, we're not quite to 2038, but we're kind of moving that way. So I'm gonna round up to 2038. This has been an area under contest by Muslims for just short of 1,400 years, which we might say is the majority of time that encompasses what is known as Western civilization. And this is why there's always been animus, there's always been conflict between the nations, the kingdoms of the West, and the Islamic Empire. There's no getting away from it.
Yeah, I would add two things with my help on that. One is in that 1,400 years, you had Arabs there for 400 years, Crusaders for about 200, and then non-Arab Muslims coming in after the Crusaders went out, including Saladin, who was a Kurd, and the Ottomans, who were Turks, who were originally from the Central Asia, not Arabs as well. Just like today, Indonesia would be the largest Muslim country in the world, and they're not Arabs at all. The
right.
issue, by the way, of the Al-Aqsa or Father Mosque is interesting. We can't get into it more than 30 seconds here. But Muhammad never came to Israel before he died, and he went to the Father Mosque. There were no mosques in Israel when he died. So the Al-Aqsa Mosque was not in Israel. And it was originally called that later on when there was a fight between two groups of Muslims, one in Syria and one in Saudi Arabia. And the Saudis, they weren't Saudis then, they were just Arabians. They stopped the Syrians from coming into Mecca. And so the Syrians said, okay, we're going to have the mosque now in Jerusalem. And that's part of Islamic history there, which is interesting. So actually, that came about later. It would be like going back to the 13 colonies when Washington, I don't think, was the capital at that time.
Right.
Same type of thing. But in any case, so what's happened with the situation here is there has been a kind of a revival in Islam that has swept across the Muslim world. And the whole idea is to get rid of any rulers who are Islamic in name, but who are not revolutionary jihadi in behavior. And that's where you get people like Osama bin Laden. And so Saudi Arabia paid Osama bin Laden to stay away from Saudi Arabia and bring his revolution to other countries. Just like Iran is doing that with Hamas and Hezbollah and all these other groups. So what's happening here is you have, there's nearly 1.5, 2 million Arabs in Israel who are citizens, have full civil rights here. But the situation in Gaza was such that it was under Egyptian control from 1948 to 1967. Egypt didn't want to turn it into Palestine. Just like in the West Bank, which was under Jordanian control 48 to 67, they didn't want to make it into Palestine because they said it's just part of our own country. So it's been kind of amorphous for a long time. And but what's been happening is Israel, through American pressure and also through some bad decisions in 2004 through 6, withdrew totally from Gaza, totally out. No Jews living there anymore. And what happened as a result was this fundamental terrorist jihadi group called Hamas, Muslim Brotherhood group, took over, kneecapped all the PLO leaders, and started building up Gaza to be a terror base to attack and destroy Israel.
Right.
Most people don't know that. And I used to travel in Gaza back in the 70s and 80s with no problems. And there were peaceful relationships until Hamas came in and began to catalyze it into a weapon against Israel. So that's kind of where we are right now. And Iran, and this whole thing is connected to Iran. That's so important for people to understand. Iran wants to restore the glory that it had when Shiite Islam nearly took over Sunni Islam. Succession wars back in the late 600s, early 700s. The glories of the Persian Empire. And they want to wipe out Saudi Arabia, control the world's oil, crush Israel, and crush America in that order. And so that's what we're seeing. And what Hamas did on October 7th was set up by Iran. Iran has said so. And the guy that Israel supposedly took out in Damascus in the past few weeks, he was the man in charge of that whole attack on Israel, which involved mass rapes, murders, tortures, kidnappings, horrific things. And basically, it's something that we in Israel have gone through a paradigm shift about. We said we cannot live with bin Laden next door. We can't do it. We can't have a toned down bin Laden. It's impossible.
Right.
And that's where we are right now.
So what you said makes a lot of sense to me. It may not totally make sense to everyone who's hearing. Let me ask a couple questions. Question one, how well do you think, I'll say Western governments, but let's break that down. The Israeli government, the US government, and all the rest of them. So it could be, the European governments and Australia and Canada and all that. We'll throw them in that third category. How well do you think these three different categories of governments understand the religious roots of the conflict that we are facing right now?
Nearly not at all, including the Israeli government. I can give a personal illustration. Israel's a small country. So one day, my wife and I were waiting to get some shawarma, which is like gyros, and in some little town outside of Jerusalem. And who walks in but the former head of the FBI of Israel? It's called the Shabak. And I've always wanted to ask him some questions, So I walked over to him. I said, "Could I bother you? Do you have a minute while you're waiting for your food?" And he said, "Sure, go ahead." And I said, "I saw you in this movie and you talked about problems. But one thing I saw, and it seems to me that everybody who's heading up intelligence in Israel, whether it's Mossad or Shabak, don't really understand the spiritual challenges and how dangerous the pressure is as a threat, jihad as a threat to Israel. Doesn't seem that people took that seriously." And he said, "Yeah, I think you're right." But of course, that's kind of what happened in October 7th, is that the leadership in the army thought, we've been able to make it financially rewarding for Hamas not to attack us. And Hamas said the same thing. So I think this is a real big problem. Westerners and secularists do not understand what's going on in the Middle East. The Middle East, it says if force doesn't work, use more force. In the West, if force doesn't work, give them more money and smile more. It doesn't work. We're talking about something far more virulent than Hitler.
Right. I remember one time when I was in my corporate years working on a contract in China. And I won't go into all the detail because it would just bog us down. But the bottom line, the management of my company could not understand why we were having the difficulty we were having in China. And their answer was pretty much what you just said. apply more money to the problem. And I had to stand up in the board of directors meeting, and I guess, as it were, lay down as a sacrificial lamb to say what I was about to say. But I said, I don't think you guys really understand the nature of the problem we have here. I said, the Chinese are interested in money, yes. I mean, more money is better than less money. But what they really want is to advance the cause of communism. And they are willing to accept reduced returns or no returns or even outright loss in order to advance the cause of communism. And you are not going to be able to buy them out. In this particular situation, the only answer is to walk away. And they thought I was crazy. They didn't fire me, but they thought I was crazy. In the end, some of them came back around and said, how did you understand that? I mean, nobody had ever said anything like that to us before. But now, with a couple more years gone by, we can see that what you said was very, I think they used the word prescient, but prophetic. And I think it's the identical issue when we're dealing with Islam. They're far less concerned about money. And sure, all things being equal, they'd rather have more than less. Who wouldn't? But they are far more driven by ideology and more particularly religious sentiment than they are by this idea of money. And consequently, Israel is a very Western country in many ways. Of course, America almost defines what we think of as the West. And then we have all the countries that in one way or another are part of the EU or the British Commonwealth. And, they kind of revolve around that orbit. But I don't think most of these people understand this at all. And that's why they approach diplomacy the way they do. But it's also why they think people like you and me are crazy and out of our minds for saying that you can't make peace with this.
Yeah, and I think this is really one of the sources. Back in the time when Europe believed the gospel,
yeah,
they understood that there was a clash of spiritual forces here. Today in Europe, very few people go to church and very few people believe in the gospel. And what they're seeing is the amount of Islamic jihadi activism in the past weeks even. You have in the main streets of Germany people calling for the overthrow of the government and the setting up of Sharia law. In the universities, the cutting edge of America's intelligentsia, you have the same type of behavior. People don't know what they're doing, of course, for the most part. They're just repeating stale communist slogans that I used to repeat back in the late 60s. I at least had read Marx and Lenin. But here you have basically people don't know what they're dealing with. Because the West has gone secular, as Gandalf would say, the light has gone out of the West.
Yes.
Because we've gone secular, we assume that the Islamic world is also secular. And it's not true. They really believe. And if we don't understand that they really believe, I was reading a book about people who are doing counterintelligence for the CIA. And they said they train counterintelligence people in the CIA by getting them to say, what would motivate an American citizen to join the CIA? You need to understand that if you're going to try to turn someone. What would motivate jihadi people to be willing to sacrifice their lives? Kill or be killed, it says in the Quran. What would motivate people to do that? If we can't understand that, we cannot defeat that threat. And Israel is stuck here because that's our threat, and so many of us are secular and don't understand it. We moved 1 inch on October 7th. We said, we can't have peace with Hamas. We can't have peace with the terrorists who are the soft underbelly of the Palestinian Authority. We can't do that. But the whole world, while we're still burying our dead, is saying, no, 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 no. Palestinian state, got to do it right now. You're not feeding your enemies. I mean, our hostages are dying of hunger, but we have to feed our enemies. Now, how does that make sense? Our hostages are in prison, but we have to let the British visit Palestinian prisoners. How does that make sense? It's set up to force us to lose. And it's interesting that in the Bible, which we don't so much believe, it says when, the book of Esther, they didn't even kill any Jews, but they were about to. And God said, okay, go. And 72,000 Persians were killed. God was all right with that. It's in the Bible, but that's not the way we believe anymore. And so we have basically tying our hands behind our back while we are the bulwark and the forward canary in the mine shaft for Western civilization.
Right.
And the West is trying to tie us down.
So what I hear you saying, without saying what I'm about to say, but this is the substance of it. We are caught in an epic, and that word is often overused, but here it is not being overused. We are caught in an epic conflict of, we can say worldviews. We might even say good versus evil. Although depending on who's listening, they might define evil differently than you and I would. But we are watching the playing out of a grand story that literally is the thrust of world history. And for many people, I think they have taken history classes in high school or college, and most people don't really cotton to history very much, and they kind of forget the details and they kind of move on, and that's the end of that. But what you're saying is the story is still going on, and we don't even realize it for the most part because we don't take the Bible seriously, which tells us we're caught in such a story. We are refusing to believe the data that's coming into us from Gaza and Iran and other places. And we think we can continue using the same old secularized tropes in order to find a solution. And yet we've proven again and again that these things don't actually work as a solution. And more to the point, Hamas themselves have said they're not interested in a two-state solution. From the river to the sea is coming right out of their mouths, and it is their intention either to wipe out Israel or die trying. End of conversation.
Right. There's so many illustrations of this. You have Puddleglum in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. You have King Theoden in Lord of the Rings, of people being literally mesmerized or a spell cast upon them. And in this case, I would call it secularism has cast a spell on the West when we're dealing with issues like communism on one hand, back in the 40s and 50s, when we're dealing now with Islam. And amazingly enough, the Bible actually talks about last days issues. But what's happened is so many people have gotten burned by that they don't even pay attention to what the Bible is saying. I came to the Lord reading a book that said that the return of the Jewish people to the land of Israel, according to the Hebrew prophecies of the Hebrew prophets, is the most significant event in the 20th century. I think most people don't see that. It was a shock to me to see that. But if God is bringing us back, and that's the vision of the dry bones in Ezekiel 37, what are they being brought back to? It says they're being brought back without the Spirit, but by the Spirit. God is bringing us back, but he hasn't filled us nationally with the Spirit. And it says when he fills us with the Spirit in verses 9 through 11 of Ezekiel 37, that we stand on our feet and we will be a huge army, much. It says in Hebrew, Chayil Gadol Me'od Me'od, a big army, much. God is bringing us back to be an army, and the world is trying to make that army illegal. Now that's kind of cruising for a bruising, and that's where we're heading. And that's going to be really the Matthew 25 separation of the nations on this point.
So this is not going to sit well with people who are interested in multilateralism. It's not going to sit well with the Davos crowd. It's not going to sit well with the vast majority of people who go to Harvard's Kennedy School of Government or the Princeton School of International Affairs, Johns Hopkins. So what this really forces us to do is to ask ourselves, do we take the Bible seriously and let it govern our decision making, or do we cast it aside as somehow an antiquated document, something that seemed nice at the time, but we've moved on because we have a better way of thinking? Now, to somebody who is a Christian, or a believing Jew, the scriptures are sacred and they can't be broken. But I think for many people, they've never really had it put to them that bluntly as I just did.
There was a story of John Wimber one time where he was teaching at a conference. I don't know if you were there, but I certainly heard it from him. And he said that some man stood up and said to him, "Just how far are you intending to go with all this?" And he picked up the Bible, held it in the air, and said, "Only as far as this book says." And the man said, "Well, I'm glad to hear that." And John said, "Yes, but have you ever read this book?
Yeah.
You've got a 500-foot angel, a talking donkey, a burning bush." So this Bible is talking about God coming back with his Jewish people to the land of Israel and to fight against the nations over that issue. That, I mean, do we follow the God of Joshua, or are we embarrassed about him?
That's a very good question. Very good question. And I don't know that we're going to answer it right here. I mean, I think you and I have thought this through. Most people probably have not. And honestly, the issue of where does the thrust of prophecy take us if we look at the Hebrew prophets, which are literally never preached in modern churches anymore at all, except, Isaiah 9, when we're, getting near Christmas time, or, whatever. Oh, yes, those who wait on the Lord will renew their strength. So we pull a few verses out that are designed to strengthen us. But there's actually a grand narrative embedded in the Hebrew prophets, which we have to reckon with.
I would just add, totally in agreement with you, two little bullet points. One is, what would we do in Germany in 1936? We would have to ask, are we willing to stand up and be counted in terms of the ethical challenges in defending the Jewish people? It would cost you perhaps your life. The second thing I think also is that I forget the second point, but that's all right. I got the first point in. That's important.
All right. Well, while you're remembering your second point, let me say the second thing I was going to say from about 10 minutes ago, which is, when we look at what Hamas did on October 7, and it's interesting to see just how much of that has been swept under the rug and from the stage by the world media, politicians. The pictures are still available. They are horrifying. Women bound, their bodies burned and charred, but their legs are spread. And so what was going on just prior to their death by fire. Pictures of people being beheaded, videos of people, whole families being slaughtered. The terrorists who came in were wearing body cams. They call them GoPros, but they were wearing body cams, not unlike what modern police do. So there is a video record of what happened in a particular, incident where the police are confronting whether it's a civilian or a possible perp. But there's some kind of a record there. They shot plenty of footage, and then they were putting it up on social media.
It was on TikTok live as it was happening.
Yeah, that's it. So, and they were putting it up on social media. Some of this maybe has been scrubbed or suppressed, but that doesn't mean the files don't exist. And so really what we've done is, as a globe, we've said, nothing to see here, folks, move along. And what we have to understand, I think, is that what Hamas did, you don't do that to end something. You do something like that to start something. That was the opening move in the Gaza war. And I could argue, I think, pretty persuasively, that it was the opening move in a wider Middle East war, which Iran had planned and been orchestrating, or planning to orchestrate, for many years. And everyone's kind of going, yeah, 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 yeah. We see nothing, we hear nothing. That actually didn't happen. But that's what October 7 was. It was like December 7, 1941 was for the United States. Interesting that both of them happened on the 7th. This was the beginning of a war taken with great intention. All Israel is doing is responding to the war that was started upon them, seeking to destroy the enemy that sought to destroy them. There is no other way to explain this. And yet it seems like I haven't heard a single newscast talk about this seriously.
I think that because of the fact that people are secular and they think church is boring and milquetoast, and therefore, why should we get into this? This is just primitive stuff. Let's look at economics. Let's look at politics. Let's look at anything else except this. And this is why it says ultimately every knee will bow and every tongue will confess.
That's right.
And Islam says the opposite, that every knee will bow and tongue confess that Muhammad is Rasul Allah. He is the messenger of Allah. The Bible says no, actually his name is not Allah, his name is Yahweh. And he says, this is the name, my personal name, it's my name forever, and I want to be known by that name. So when believers and Christians had already abandoned that focus and allegorized everything, they were fair game for whatever came along. And I know it doesn't feel very ecumenical, but we're not heading toward ecumenicism. We're heading into the belly of World War III.
That's exactly correct. And again, the opening move was made on October the 7th. All right. So it seems that with this as our backdrop, it seems that Israel as a nation state, but also as a people, the Jewish people, Israel can't seem to catch a break, no matter which way you define it, nation state or an ethnicity. Israel was founded, as we said, in the wake of World War II. It was a homeland for the Jews following Hitler's undisputed genocide. I mean, there's no question what Hitler was trying to do. He documented it in Mein Kampf. He built concentration camps to kill Jews with industrial efficiency and then to incinerate them. And he did a pretty good job wiping out the majority of European Jewry. Thankfully, there were Jews elsewhere in diaspora, so he didn't get them all. But he did a very, very good job. Well, good in the sense of thorough, of committing genocide. And it's interesting. People keep saying Israel's committing genocide, and yet here they are feeding the very people that allegedly they're trying to wipe out. It's a complete misconstrual of the word genocide to apply it in this context, because that's not what Israel is doing. And in fact, some of the footage that was coming out of Gaza with the locals sitting on the beach with nowhere else to go, and Israeli troops milling around and giving them food and water. Look, if they wanted to commit genocide, they should have been digging ditches, machine gunning them, and throwing the bodies in the ditches, but they weren't doing that.
There's an Arabic proverb that says, first he hits me, and then he cries, and then he runs to the lawyer. And this is the same dynamic of what's going on here. That basically Hamas has as a war strategy to hide among civilians and to fire at Israel's civilians from among Gazan civilians. According to the laws of war, you're allowed to go in and take out that threat. So then they go underground. So Israel has to go underground, which means higher casualties for Israelis. Colonel Richard Kemp, who was one of the authorities in fighting, worked with the British and NATO in Yugoslavia. He said there is no army in the world which has had as much concern for avoiding civilian casualties as Israel. And he said the percentages are 1 to 9, with Americans and British 1 to 7. With Israel, it's 1 to 1 or 1 to 2. And he said, just so that they're being attacked with a false charge of genocide. And again, we could get into it in greater detail, and I do that in the letters that I write and stuff. But and you can get this on internet certainly as well. But yeah, this is a war strategy. And
Right.
so the very things that Hamas is doing, they're doing genocide. They wanted, it's calls in their covenant, it calls for the total genocide of the Jewish people. They've
Right.
never denied that. And they said any agreements they make are only temporary. They will never give up the goal of genocide. And they say eventually Islam is going to fully destroy the Jewish people. So that's genocide for sure. But what they
Yep.
do then is they turn it upside down and they say it's the Jews who are doing the genocide.
And
If
then and then
Hamas,
they incite and then they incite university students all over the world to stage protests.
yes, yes, indeed. So it's nearly like it's exactly the opposite of what one is hearing in the media, which is true. Which brings us into the days of 1984.
Right. Or in a Russian term, desinformatitsia.
Yes, yes, indeed.
So as I was saying, it seems like Israel, whether defined as the nation or the Jewish people, they can't catch a break. And certainly the establishment of the state of Israel was, shall we say, contested. And, basically Israel was birthed in war because the Arabs began attacking. And then there's been a series of wars since then. We had the 67 war, we had the 73 war, we had the Lebanon war in 1982, which was a little different. Israel was trying to go after the PLO, but still heavy fighting. There was another war in Lebanon in the early 2000s. You would know the exact year. I want to say '05, but I may be off.
2006.
Okay. So I was off by 1 year, 2006. We've had the intifadas, the uprisings, and there's been more than this. I'm just naming some of them. We shouldn't forget the Suez Crisis and more. But the bottom line is there's been conflict around Israel the whole time. And then October 7 comes, and it was the most destructive and vile of all these conflicts. And as we already noted, there were hundreds of people raped, burned alive, beheaded, and I would even say taken away to captivity. We call them hostages, but this is not particularly different, although it's smaller in scale perhaps, than the taking away of the Jews when Ashurbanipal came to the North Kingdom and when Nebuchadnezzar came to the South Kingdom, because I think it's safe to say Hamas doesn't really particularly have any desire to let these people go. They either want to enslave them, whether as sex slaves or whatever they are, or just kill them outright.
Yeah, well, it's interesting with Assyria, you had exchange of population with or moving peoples around, ethnic
Well, and
cleansing.
interbreeding them, right? Isn't that one of the most ancient strategies of war? Breed them out.
Yeah, that they moved a lot of people out. Assyria did, especially from the
Yep.
West Bank. They brought other people in. Eventually, that happened, but that took a 2, 3, 400 years. Babylon exchanged people.
Yep.
Well, they took people away. So, but they didn't try to do genocide. This is genocide. This is a little bit different. Um, this would be more like the people who would invade, and try to destroy the Jewish people totally in some book of Judges and stuff like that. But this is what's going on, and it's not going to stop. It really is not going to stop. Only one person walks away from the battle. It's like the old Viking battles with the berserkers. Only one person comes out of the circle. And
Right.
that's what we're dealing with. And the Bible talks about it. If one wants to read Zechariah 12 through 14, there's a huge amount of information there. Ezekiel 38 and 39, there's information there. These are real passages, and we're about to walk into these things. So it's worth reading, studying, and praying and saying, God, how can I be ready, especially when I may be called to lay down my life for what you consider important? It's interesting. I remember the other point. Yeshua had a lot of respect for military men. He turned and he said, I haven't found as much faith among all of Israel as this one guy, the centurion.
Yeah.
Because he understood authority and he understood combat. Today, we're anti-war and we don't understand authority and we don't understand combat.
Right. Right. Very well put. Well, it has been said by more than one historian that when a society implodes, the last place that you find discipline and order is in the military.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we're observing that, at least in the United States, on a pretty large scale.
Yeah, I fear for America. I cry for America and I pray for America.
Yeah, we need those prayers. All right, so let's go on here. We've kind of talked about the background as a refresh, and I think we're going a little deeper in a few of these points than we have in the past. In addition to its neighbors, the Christian church has also been an opponent of Israel at various times. A lot of theologians have made the argument that the church is the new Israel of God. And of course, they're drawing from one specific passage in the New Testament. But when they make that statement, they're also saying that the covenants made with the patriarchs are now null and void, that what the Lord spoke through Moses doesn't really matter. And I remember being in Israel with you maybe 6 or 7 years ago, and we didn't go up there, but you pointed out a particular church from a particular denomination, and there was a very well-known figure from the Bible who is also well recognized in the church, and this individual was standing on top of the
Ark of the
but not in
Covenant.
the sense of Ark of the Covenant. Thank you. That's right. And not in the sense of we're building from there. It was more in triumph because that now no longer matters. So what would you say, Avner, to the checkered history of the Christian church in its dealings with the Jewish people?
I would say two things. First of all, the Jewish people have a checkered history in terms of dealing with the nations too, which is talked about in Romans 1 and 2.
Yep.
But I would say it's a misunderstanding of love and grace. The feeling is somehow that God must be an abusive father who's so angry with the Jews that he can't wait to get rid of them because he loves the Gentiles more because they're so nice. So that doesn't understand God's love in Romans, where he says, this love is unchanging. Romans 11, 20 and 29 says, the gifts and the calling of God on Israel are irrevocable. Now, that is really the axis for this whole question. If they're irrevocable to the Jews, then where do we get a teaching that God has gotten rid of the Jews because of their sin? Or he never really intended to work with them, and the promises he made to them can be just turned like putty into something else. So that's really very, very important. And the second thing is, what is grace? I run into this a lot when people say, why is God restoring the Jews to the land? They're not believers. And I said, well, what's your definition of grace? And they say, unmerited favor. And I say, well, then can God have unmerited favor on the Jewish people? Because he says he's going to bring them back, and he says they're going to come to faith. So can we allow him to do that? And so replacement theology essentially violates both the love and the grace of God in the name of false religiosity.
Wow. Say that again. That needs to be said again for the record.
Yeah, I used an improper adjective there. Replacement theology violates the character and the heart of God specifically, and violates the issue of both grace and love of God by setting up a false, a religiosity which is false. That's the way one should say it, not a false religiosity, because religiosity is not the goal anyway.
Right. Yeah, that's right. All right. So replacement theology has become, I would say, at least in many quarters, maybe not quite universally, but in many quarters, it's become the go-to of Christian theology vis-a-vis the Jews. And with it, it's almost as though no one's listening when Paul talks about wild olive branches being grafted in, and why are you boasting anyway? And so I like to say when I teach on this, and you do it far better than I do, but when I teach on these topics, I often tell everybody, whether you know it or not, you are a Jew because you were grafted into the olive tree. Now,
Well, yeah, I would probably tweak that a little bit because Paul actually doesn't say that. What he says is Gentiles come into the commonwealth of Israel. That's his term in
yeah,
Ephesians 2 and 3.
yeah,
So it's not that they become Jews anymore, that because we're part of the bride of Christ, that I lose my beard. See,
right.
we're still men, we're still women, we're still Jews, we're still Gentiles, but we come into a Jewish country club.
There you go.
And the Jewish country club is 99% Gentile.
Right.
But what happened is the wallpaper used to have Stars of David on it, and it was totally covered over. And so when a Jew comes in, he says, this is not a Jewish place,
Right.
and Jesus is not the Jewish Messiah.
That's right. Well, I was going to go there. You beat me to it, but anyway, we're definitely saying the same thing, and I think a very significant part of what God is doing right now across Christendom, for those who have ears to hear, is He is highlighting anew and afresh the essential Jewish nature of Christianity.
Yeah.
And with that, Gentiles who may have never ever given even one moment's thought to anything Jewish are having to think about the fact that this is a religion based in Judaism, founded by Jews, a particular Jew, Jesus, the majority of which theology was written by another Jew named Paul. You can't escape the Jewishness of Christianity, and it's almost like we need to somehow on a wide scale de-Gentilize what has come to be the common expression of the Christian faith.
There's a famous missiological term, it's called to contextualize.
Yes.
With the Jewish people, it's actually recontextualized. You got to bring it back to what it was. That's why some of my dear friends who talk about being on the cutting edge of apostolic faith, and I say, well, if it ain't Jewish, it's not the cutting edge of apostolic faith. Because we're going to do a full circle. We're coming back full circle. It's not going to be built, in Dallas or Geneva or Tulsa. It's going to be built in Jerusalem. That's where
won't be built in Rome either.
In Rome, I'm protecting all the other parties here. But this is the challenge, and Ruth's power was that she's still called a Moabite. She was never called a Jew. She was a Moabite. And it's when Gentiles can enter into that calling of saying, okay, I was called to make the Jewish people jealous. That's what Paul says, that God comes to the Gentiles in order to make the Jewish people jealous. What's going to make Jewish people jealous about the way the church is behaving today? That's a good question.
That's a very good question. Yeah. Well, this is what I love about talking to you, Avner. I always learn something when I talk to you. You help me articulate what I'm trying to say even better. And
you're a pretty articulate person. You're a pretty articulate person to begin with, and I love you too, like a brother.
So you're going to be one of our speakers at the upcoming Ignition Conference, October 3 to 5 in Nashville, Tennessee. And one of the topics I've asked you to address, obviously you have some latitude to do other things too, but I've asked you to address how to answer replacement theology and God's role for the Jews. We've kind of walked through various facets of this already today, but do you want to give us a preview or a sampling of what further you might have to say on that subject and why it is so vitally important for our listeners and any Christian really who wants to be involved in a sustainable move of God to learn to think rightly about God and his plan for Israel and the Jewish people?
I'll try to give an answer in 60 seconds.
You can have more than that.
Yeah. The Bible is 95% written by Jews, 95% written about Jews. And whenever it's preached on Sunday, it's never about Jews unless it's bad. And so I think the first thing, as Gordon Fee, the famous Pentecostal theologian, said, is read the Bible for all it's worth. Read what it says. And when it says the Jews, don't say, well, that means me. Say, God spent so much effort and pain in time and history. People died to pass this on. What does it really mean? So if it says, I have plans for you for good and not for evil, to give you a hope and a future, what does that mean in Jeremiah 29? Does it mean that this is, that my lawn is going to be greener and my relationships in school are going to be better? It could apply to that, but that's not what it means in terms of major meaning. It means God was speaking to the Jews in Babylon. He was saying, I'm not going to leave you in exile. I'm going to take you back to Israel. And my plans involve a full restoration. I call it like country music backward. Because when you play country music, it's about I lost my wife, I lost my pickup truck, I lost my dog. And when you play country music backwards, that's restoration. You get back your dog, you get back your pickup, and you get back your wife. Although some apostolic groups say, no, you get back somebody else's wife. And that's not restoration at all. But yeah, so I think that if we just read the Bible and ask, what does it mean? What is he saying? That's going to change our theology. It's very radical. And actually, the word radical comes from the Latin word radix, which means root.
Yes.
Like radish. Radish is a root plant. And so if we're going to be radical, we go back to what the Bible actually meant, as opposed to, and we use this for ourselves as a devotional blessing. I'm not against devotional blessing, but what does it mean? So if we just go to there, I think we can't end up replacement theology.
Amen. I completely agree. I remember being in seminary and people were pushing replacement theology at me. And I was thinking, you and I aren't reading the same Bible. And I don't mean like, you're in the RSV and I'm in the NIV or whatever, King James and New American Standard. That wasn't what I meant. It was, how are you not coming to terms with things like Romans 9-11? How are you not coming to terms with passages out of Ezekiel, like Ezekiel 37? And one of my seminary professors actually said in front of the class, and I mean, it was kind of tongue in cheek, but he wasn't kidding. It was said jokingly, but he wasn't kidding. He said, when I get to passages like that, I get out my penknife and I cut those pages out of the Bible because I don't agree with them and I don't like them.
Sounds like Jeremiah and the king there who was cutting pieces of the prophecy and throwing him into the coal brazier.
That's exactly right.
One prophecy at a time.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Well, everyone, this is Avner Boskey. He's my good friend and has been for, gosh, I don't even know now, 30 plus years, maybe nearing 40 now. And I prophesied the birth of his fourth child. And he is, he's an amazing teacher of the Bible. He understands the languages. He understands the culture. You don't want to miss him in Nashville, Tennessee over October 3 to 5. And therefore, you should be signing up for our Ignition conference and getting a cheaper price than you'll pay at the door if it's not already sold out.
Houston, we have Ignition.
That's it. That's exactly it. And as we're making this podcast, Avner, we've opened registration already, and we have already sold several hundred tickets to our conference. So I have little doubt that we're going to sell out. That we'll probably have some online options, I think, assuming we can get all the technical bugaboo worked out. But anyway, folks, if you want to come and hear Avner and all of our other great speakers, you want to sign up soon, and we'll look forward to seeing all of you in Nashville. And Avner, I'm going to look forward to spending some more time with you when you're here stateside. Grant, do you have anything you want to add before we sign off today?
No, I could listen to you guys talk about this for a while. So thanks so much for both of you for helping us understand a little better of what's going on and how we can pray and think and live. And look forward to learning more. Avner, always fun talking, hanging out, and looking forward to spending time with you as well. Thank you all for tuning in and to listening to this week's episode of God is Not a Theory with Ken Fish. We'll be right back next week, same time, same place, with another episode of God is Not a Theory with Ken Fish.
Join us at the upcoming Ignition Conference in Nashville, Tennessee, October 3rd through the 5th. At the conference, Ken will be joined by Jack Deere, Cindy Jacobs, Chris Reed, Stacy Campbell, Putty Putman, Jeremy Nelson, and others as they explore how to build a sustainable move of God. Registration is now open for the conference, and early bird pricing ends on Sunday, June 30th. If you're interested in attending, you can click on the link below in the description of this podcast and register today.